Welcome to the Star Trek Bestiary, where I do the law on the things. I thought, considering the season, it would be fun to look at some of the creepier encounters in Star Trek, and I don't mean that ghost lamp. To begin with, let's look at the being that identified itself as Isabella, the FGC-47 lifeform. This creature is actually the first pure energy being that I've covered in this series, although there have been others with some energy-based anatomy. And while not totally malevolent, it and its species were a genuine threat to the Enterprise D and quite capable of eventually destroying it. What gives it the creepy edge for me is the fact that it posed as Clara Suter's invisible friend while it scouted the vessel. This creature is rather small, but we did see several varieties of it, and its environment itself might actually be a part of it. The one that entered the starship was only a dozen or so centimetres, while the ones that attached themselves to the shields were far larger, judging by the scale shown here. As mentioned, they are non-corporeal energy beings that float around just as easily in the vacuum of space as within an atmosphere. They were encountered within the FGC-47 nebula, which consists of hydrogen, helium and trionium, and has formed around a neutron star. Initially, these creatures were undetectable to the sensor systems of the Enterprise as they entered into the mists, and the first indicator that anything was wrong was when the ship struck something it couldn't see and began to drag. Unknown to the crew, there were a series of high-energy plasma strands woven throughout FGC-47 that would only reveal themselves in the presence of a warp field. These strands in turn interacted with the ship's shields, essentially causing a drag effect, slowing down the vessel. It was effectively a spider's web of snaring strands, but also one that was movable to the creatures that dwelt within. After the issue was uncovered, the Enterprise found that its retreat had been cut off, with 10 times the amount of strands obscuring their path out. At one point, they detected 47 million individual fibres within a 2,000 kilometre sphere of the ship. This was the environment for the creatures, but it could perhaps even be that these were actually extensions of them, or just a product like spider silk, we don't know for sure. But the creatures could control the fibres, and these lifeforms themselves were sentient, and before the shields raised could pass through matter unimpeded. While in their energy orb state, they could perceive and fly at will, and evaded detection for as long as possible. It could also mimic other life forms, as it did when it duplicated a flower after passing into it. Presumably it simply mimicked its image, in this case, but things get stranger when it enters the mind of the adolescent Clara Suter. After somehow scanning her thoughts through contact with her brain, she was able to adopt the form of her imaginary friend Isabella, with a close or perfect approximation of what Clara expected to see. However, it seems that this being could not directly read her thoughts after she had assumed the Isabella form, as she began to act in ways unfamiliar to the child. The energy being could also render itself completely invisible, which makes me wonder why it was sneaking around earlier, but Clara could still hear her, suggesting some form of link still at play. Additionally, it seemed as if originally it was unable to travel too far from Clara, but that later proved to be a limitation born only of the fact that it wanted to remain near her. Its goal was to explore the ship, predominantly main engineering and locations with many people. Well, the former is easy to explain. It wanted to feed off the energy reserves in the core, but the latter is unsettling, because these creatures can feed off people's energy too, as it did by stunning Troy, sapping her strength and disrupting her bioelectrical processes, so evidently it was evaluating the rest of the crew as potential sources of food. The creatures did have a weakness or two, however. They could be detected in the presence of a warp field, and once that was in place they were detectable to sensors. Additionally, they could not pass through deflector shields but could feed off them. Several of these energy vortices could have drained them from max in 8 minutes. Fortunately, however, they are intelligent creatures and could be reasoned with. The reason for this hostility was simply that their scout had determined that the crew were cruel creatures who placed unfair limitations at a whim on others. He had come to that conclusion because it did not differentiate between the adult point of view and a child's, which also suggested that when these beings are created, well, they do so without an adolescence. However they procreate, they probably don't grow up, as most biological creatures do. once it understood that the crew of the Enterprise were benign, it backed off, as did its web and allies, while the Enterprise then released a large amount of energy for them to feed off by way of an olive branch. So while this one did have a happy ending, and the threat was basically a misunderstanding between different lifeforms, the fact that this energy vortex creature basically haunted a young girl and then started getting aggressive to the crew was kind of unsettling. The limits the adults place on children, no matter how slight, must have seemed overbearing for a species that had no concept of childhood and dwelt in the limitless expanse of space. But at least it was all's well in the end. Thanks for watching this video on the FGC-47 entities, and until the next creature, I've been Rick. Goodbye.